Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Topical Talkology, and nothing can be more topical than what's happening right now, which is the coronavirus epidemic, or pandemic rather, that's just happening around the world. And today we've got a special guest. It's Dr. Simon Valentine, who's a GP who's currently on the front line, having to deal with all this as well amongst his patients. And I'm here again with Theo, who's got his background is in psychiatry. So let's get started. So there's three things we're probably going to look to cover today. We're going to look at the physical aspects of the coronavirus and the impact it's having on people. We will talk about the mental state, which is what Theo's going to cover. And then I'll start looking at the social aspects and how it's affecting people's work lives and things like this. So let's get started. So good afternoon, Dr.
Just to say that although we're in a room together, we are gloved and masked, and sitting a fair distance apart with very long leads. So rest assured, we are not contraindicating any of the anti-infection protocols.
Except we're a group of three, though, Theo, aren't we?
There's three, yes. But you could probably say if I'm in another room, technically. Okay, so let's get started. So good afternoon, Dr. Valentine.
Good afternoon, Andy. Good afternoon, Theo.
Yes, good afternoon. So I understand you were at a seminar yesterday for the coronavirus. Is that correct?
Yes, we had a CCG, that's a community care group, commissioning group webinar session for all the GPs in Ealing Commissioning Group, just outlining what our plans are in response to this terrible virus.
And were there any nuggets that you were able to take away from the webinar yesterday?
I think the main thing to say from our point of view as general practitioners is that we have set up what's called a hot hub. There are going to be a series of these in Ealing, but the first one, which is due to open tomorrow, Friday, is at Mattock Lane. And that's going to be manned from 10 a.m. till 7 p.m. every single day. And the point of that hub is it's a point of referral for all the GPs in Ealing to refer suitable patients, and I'll come on to that if you'd like me to. So it's not for patients just to turn up on their own uninvited. They have to be referred by their own general practitioner. And then Mattock Lane will contact that patient, and then they will be, in fact, triaged again before being accepted.
So let me ask you this: how are you actually coping with what's happening as a GP who's got a practice in the Ealing area?
Good question, Andy. One of the main ways in which we're managing this is we are not seeing and not doing any non-essential work. So routine monitoring of people for blood pressures, diabetic monitoring, those sorts of things, they're not being done. To give you another example, practice nurse is really only doing wound care that needs to be seen to, and childhood immunisations, which are, of course, very important. Apart from that, routine things like cervical smears, they're all being put on hold. Blood tests, generally speaking, put on hold. So, in fact, we are doing a lot less work than we normally do. And the result of that is that people aren't coming to the surgery, and they're not moving around, and they're not spreading the virus.
I mean, I know this is probably an impossible question to answer, but how long do you think a pandemic like this will last? Or, I mean, as I said, it's very hard to anticipate, but how long do they normally last? I mean, Theo, you actually were reading an article yesterday about the level the plagues going back over the centuries.
Yes, indeed. Historically, it's interesting because humans have been around for 200,000 years, whereas bacteria have been around for 300 billion. And following close on that are viruses. And in fact, there are well-documented pandemics. Plague of Athens, 430 BC, killed a third of Athenians, typhoid-like plague. And then there's the Antonine Plague in Rome, AD 200. measles-like illness, and then there was the Justinian plague in the Byzantine Empire, which actually lasted almost 200 years, killing about 25% of their population. And then there was the Black Death in 1347, and that lasted 5 years. And both the Justinian plague and the Black Death were Yersinia pestis. And then, just rattling through, there was the Columbian Exchange Plague, 1492, the Great Plague of London, 1665, the Third Plague Pandemic, 1855, the Russian Flu, 1889, Spanish Flu, 1918 to 1919. So
the coronavirus, it was never going to exactly be an exciting podcast, was it, in some way?
Well, and also a very high mortality in these, very high, as we were saying, up to a third of people.
Let me ask you this, because we were discussing it in the car, because, I mean, when you took something like the coronavirus and the percentage of people that it's actually affecting, I mean, how does that compare to something like Ebola or SARS, for example, which has a far more significant death rate? Is that, would I be correct in quoting stats like that? Well, I haven't quoted stats, but is it more significant? And
well, I don't know about SARS, Andy, but yes, certainly Ebola is a lot more fatal. But I think the problem that we've got is we just do not know how many people are infected because we are not testing people. The government have changed their strategy basically because they're getting too many people infected. So the only people that are being tested for coronavirus now are the really sick people that are ending up in A&E departments and being admitted into the hospital. So unless you're, Prince Charles or Camilla, then generally speaking, if you get you get sick with the virus, you're just encouraged to stay at home and wait it out.
do you think it's a good strategy the government's employed?
Well,
from a medical profession, it's probably very different to someone who's got a small business or economically, I suppose. So they probably have two different perspectives on that. But from a medical point of view, have they taken the correct measures, and have they left it too late, in your opinion?
Hard for me to answer that, Andy, but broadly speaking, and a huge question, I think the government have responded appropriately at pretty much every stage. I would not criticise them at this point, that's for sure.
So I've got a question I actually wrote down earlier, is as a GP, particularly in an area where the social demographic is a mixture of large, ageing and young family population, what are the main issues you're seeing?
Well, Andy, here where we are in the leafy suburbs of Ealing, it has been fairly quiet in general practice. People are staying in their houses, but they're not ringing up for appointments. They've all received texts saying their routine appointments are cancelled. I think they all understand the situation, and generally speaking, it is a lot quieter here in general practice, and probably around about 50% of the numbers that we would normally, I was going to say see, but we're not seeing anyone or hardly anyone, but about 50% of the normal contacts, and they're all being telephoned. Many of them are receiving prescriptions electronically, which are going to their local pharmacies, and either the patient or one of their family is picking up the medication for them.
Actually, out of all the information, because there's been an enormous amount of information being put out there on the internet and social media and things like that, it's almost very hard to actually separate what's actually true and what's not. And so the question I've got for you is, what is the myth that you would actually like to bust about the virus right now? Sorry if I put you on the spot.
No, well, you put me on the spot. I think one of the myths maybe is that this virus doesn't affect younger people significantly, but in fact, in Italy, right at the moment, 1/3 of the cases who are in ICU are previously fit and well people between the ages of 50 and 65. So I guess that's one myth that maybe we can bust. It isn't just affecting elderly people or people with pre-existing conditions.
Actually, it's interesting because I actually took some notes actually before we did this, and I was looking at the most vulnerable people who are out there, and they do say that the over 80s have a far higher higher rate of susceptibility or vulnerability in terms of that. And the thing is, age is nothing you can control, but there were 6 factors that came out, and one of them was people not eating enough nutrients, for example, is one factor. And the other one is genetics. One of them is a weak immune system. And the person I was listening to online, he was talking about that antibiotics, steroids and drugs, for example, are things that actually impact or actually increase the level of vulnerability to that. Would you agree with that, or do you want to enlighten us on that, or
I
would
don't
I be
know
wrong?
a lot about it, Andy. I have heard that taking steroids, which of course many of our asthmatic patients will be familiar with, may not be a sensible course of action because it dampens down the immune response. I mean, they're normally used in asthma to dampen down the inflammatory response. So we're not quite sure at the moment whether steroids are a good thing or a bad thing.
Okay, so one of the other things they talked about is if you've got an existing chronic disease, for example, that's going to actually have an effect on your immune system, which is going to make you susceptible. So people obviously need to be able to take care of that. But one of the things that people don't really talk about that much is stress. Which actually does lower your immune system and actually does make you more susceptible. Is that something that you could agree? Do you agree with that, or because particularly now, particularly when people are actually having to stay at home, the whole pattern's changing, the whole routine's changing. With all the media attention that it's actually getting, it's causing a lot of stress amongst people and loneliness as well, because if people are having to self-isolate, people who don't literally engage with others because we are social beings, is going to cause an enormous amount of stress, which is going to actually have an impact on them. You'd probably be able to highlight this more, wouldn't you, Theo?
I would just like to say, I mean, you're absolutely right, Andy, and we only have to look at illnesses, particularly, for example, eczemas, in general practice, and to see what the impact of stress is on causing or being contributory to flare-ups of eczema. It's a very, very common provocative factor. But I don't know what you've got to say on the matter, Theo.
Or even stress on depression, panic, heart attacks, strokes. So stress is very, very significant. And of course, if the whole population is being stressed, they're more vulnerable to a virus.
Because it's not something that's actually being really addressed. It's not something that's really being addressed. They're looking at it very much from a medicinal point of view and physical point of view, but they're not really looking at the mental state of a patient, I suppose, or because you can't really, I suppose, because you actually have to sort of be very reactive rather than proactive about how to actually approach it.
Well, that's right. And what's very difficult for the government is that they're having to listen to experts, but also appease the panic caused by the media. And it might be useful just to look at some statistics. So in Spain, there have been 50,000 cases with 3,500 deaths. 8% of those have been severe infections. In Germany, 40,000 cases with 222 deaths. Very, very few, in fact, have been severe infections. China, 81,000 cases with 3,200 deaths. In Italy, 74,000 with 7,500 deaths. United Kingdom, 10,000 cases as of this morning with 465 deaths. Sweden, 2,500 cases with 62 deaths. The reason I mentioned them is because they're refusing to do lockdown at the moment. Now, what's relevant is that in the whole world, there's been 500,000 coronavirus cases with 21,000 deaths. And if you put that into perspective, a bad year in the UK for influenza will finish off 30,000 people. Same in Italy. So in the whole world up to now, there have not